It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Stephen Kaplan. Steve was educated at Brandeis University and Harvard Divinity School and obtained his PhD at Hebrew University. Steve taught African study and medieval history at the Hebrew University for over 35 years, where he also served as the Dean of Humanities, Director of the Truman Institute, the Provost of the Rothenberg School, and Chair of the Institute of Asian and African Studies, among other jobs that Steve had at the university. Steve has written extensively on the history of Christianity in Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, and you reminded me this morning that you had the courage at the early stages of your career to work with Dr. Ruth.
And you saw my extra thing that you asked.
Oh, sorry, I took it. And, you know, think about it. A young scholar who is dedicated to Christianity in Africa and then goes to work with Dr. Ruth at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. That was really a brave, decision. Currently, Steve is working on a new book that is going to be out in, I think, this year, later this year, and where he offers a revised view of Ethiopian history up to the 1500s. And I think that what's really exciting, as I said in the beginning, at least for me, and also for Professor Ruth Gineo was here, that Steve was our teacher and mentor, and we're really happy to be here. And obviously you installed in us the love to the history of Africa, so thank you very much, Steve, and the floor is yours, but you can still say something.
Well, firstly, you didn't read the whole thing that I put in parentheses, because I said that among my many distinguished former students are Galia Tsabar and Ruth Gineo, Dr. Leonardo Cohen, Dr. Bar Kribus. Am I missing someone else who's in the hall right now? And Dr. Professor Len Schler will be talking also as part of this conference. Let me just say a word about Dr. Ruth, since that was, when you said something else. I did 3 books with Dr. Ruth. She passed away last year at the age of 96. She was a Holocaust survivor. She was wounded in Israel's War of Independence. She did fundraising, I think, for 3 or 4 different Israeli universities and received an honorary doctorate from Ben Gurion University. She was an amazing person. It's a special pleasure for me to be back here in Jerusalem and to participate in this conference. I will try very much to keep to the time, and as part of that, basically, if I get cut short on time, the whole point of my lecture is already given at the beginning. What I want to argue is that Ethiopian Christianity, as most of what we talk about in Ethiopian history, is really the result of 2 processes. The medieval imagining or reimagining of events which are said to have occurred in late antiquity, and texts, rituals, observances, images which date from the 13th century onward, but are particularly from the reigns of Emperor Dawid and his son Zar Yaakov. So we're actually in the same period that we were hearing about with some of the plagues, but I'm not going to be talking about the plagues. To make this sort of real to people and some of the challenges, let me begin by talking about Ethiopian food. I often say that most people who know nothing about Ethiopia know 2 things: famine and food. The early Portuguese, when they came to Ethiopia, complained that the food was very spicy. But of course, prior to the 16th century, what's called the Columbian Exchange, the reason for the spiciness of that food could not have been what it is now, because the peppers that are used in Ethiopian food now are native to Central and South America, and it had to have been sent to Ethiopia. So again, the food may have been spicy, but it's not the kai, red-colored hot food we know now. Somewhat more speculatively, an article was recently published, and I should say most of what I'm doing today is synthesis, arguing that while teff, the Ethiopian grain, has existed in the Horn of Africa for millennia, that the consumption of the grain greatly increased in the period from around the 1520s, and that anjara, the pancakes that everyone knows, actually became a staple food only in the middle of the 18th century. Now, this is speculative, but I will let experts decide. And of course, we're on much firmer ground when we come to coffee. There's a widespread tradition that the coffee was discovered by a shepherd in the Kaffa region of Ethiopia because of the behavior of its goats. It should be noted that story only exists in versions from the 17th century. So while coffee may have been indigenous to the area, the story is late. And moreover, as we know from very many places, the brewing of coffee is a 15th century phenomena, and for that matter, for Christian Ethiopians, did not drink coffee because it was associated with Muslims and spirit cults until at least the 19th century. Now, as we say in Hebrew, chas v'chalila, I have no intention to spoil your enjoyment of traditional, authentic Ethiopian food, but I think these examples give us a good sense of how easily we can look at things and think they are ancient or primordial, when of course they always have a history to them. And I should say, it's almost a joke when you talk to Ethiopians. Ethiopians almost always begin when you ask about something with, well, 3,000 years ago, such and such. And so we begin with, of course, the Queen of Sheba. Every few years, there's an exciting announcement from archaeologists that they have found the palace of the Queen of Sheba, perhaps in Ethiopia, perhaps in Yemen, perhaps in West Africa. But the classic Ethiopian story of the queen, the Kebra Nagast, is generally agreed to have surfaced or resurfaced in the early 14th century. So again, early tradition, but later evidence. And in this context, while archaeologists have made tremendous progress in reconstructing early Aksumite civilization, as our host, Professor Fauvel, and his colleague Bertrand Hirsch wrote more than a quarter century ago, the sacred geography of the city of Aksum is largely the reconstruction made by Zara Yacob, an emperor who ruled in the 15th century. I know it's probably not a shock to people here in the Holy Land that much of the sacred geography of a place is not actually historically accurate, but was reconstructed by later people. But it should be pointed out that this is the case with regard to Ethiopia as well. I should mention that 50 years ago, the scholar Sven Rubinson noted that while Ethiopian monarchy was associated with the lion, and the Ethiopian monarchy was associated with the tribe of Judah, the first time that we have it associated together as the Lion of Judah is in the 16th century, first with the Portuguese and then with other sources. Now, when Ethiopians talk about the beginning of Christianity in Ethiopia, they tell the story from Acts of the Apostles about the Ethiopian, perhaps he was a eunuch, a servant of the great Queen Candace, who was converted by the Apostle Philip. There was actually a site on the border between Israel and the Palestinian Authority where there's a pool which commemorates this event. I should say that without getting very political, the border there seems to be moving all the time and getting more and more into the Israeli part of it. And the Ethiopians had tremendous incentives, of course, to claim that Christianity was ancient. They commemorate the eunuch's conversion in their calendar. And the great scholar of Ethiopia, Edward Uhlendorf, who had an MA from the Hebrew University, wrote, "The Ethiopians have, from a very early period, applied this episode to themselves." The very early source that he cites for this very early period is the Kebra Nagast, which, as I said a few minutes ago, is probably a 14th century source. And there's a good case to be made that as part of the Ethiopians taking on the mantle of being Ethiopia from the Nubians, one of the things that they took on was this story. It is interesting to note that there is no depiction of the conversion of the eunuch in any pre-modern Ethiopian church or in any pre-modern Ethiopian manuscript, although the chapel, which is in the residence of the Archbishop here in Jerusalem in the Old City, is dedicated to the eunuch, but of course, that's a very modern, relatively modern building. When Ethiopia does become a Christian country, there is a tremendous amount of speculation as to how Christianity established itself and spread. And there are stories, which until recently were taken very seriously historically, about 5th century and 6th century foreign missionaries, often said to have come from Syria, the Tzadkan and the 9 saints. However, again, recent research has indicated that these lives are, to quote, much later interpretations of the facts transmitted through a medieval cultural background. In fact, the life of Pantaleon, one of these saints, was written in the 14th century, and that is the earliest of these lives to have been composed. The next earliest is Abba Garima, which was written in the 15th century, and some of these texts are actually 18th and 19th century texts. Similarly, the art historian, the late Marilyn Heldman, and the ethnomusicologist Kay Kaufman-Chalamet have recently published an article in which they argue that the traditions of Saint Yared, who is said to have been the creator of Ethiopian sacred music, do not date from earlier than the 15th century. So all of these that I've been talking about up to now are cases where we have early Ethiopian stories, but increasingly scholars view them as the product of a medieval thought. I'm reminded when I present this, when I was a young scholar, there was a joke that someone was told that they needed to publish 7 articles to get tenure. So they published 6 of them and a 7th explaining why the first 6 were wrong. And I sometimes feel that way when I'm writing now and look at things that I wrote 40 years ago. A very important part of this story is that between the 13th and 18th century, dozens, perhaps hundreds of works were translated from Arabic into Ge'ez. It's so numerous, no one has compiled a complete list of how many of these works there are. And it's difficult to think of any circumstance in which a church has taken into its religious body so many works 1,000 years after the conversion to Christianity. And translations from Arabic were a conduit for many, many other traditions. I show this example here from my friend and colleague, Aaron Butts. You see, the death of Aaron, not his, but the Kohen, was written in Syriac. There were 2 Arabic versions of the translated. One of them became the basis for the Ethiopian Christian version, and one of them became the basis for the Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jewish version. Now, one of these things that this transmission does, especially of the Syriac material, whether it's St. Ephraim of James of Sarug or John Saba, is it also contributes to this veneer of antiquity. Because you say, oh, they have a work from St. Ephraim. Ephraim lived in the 4th century. That must be tremendous antiquity until you begin to realize that since translation from Arabic to Ge'ez only began in the 13th century, it can't have reached Ethiopia any earlier than that. And this was a major process for Ethiopian Christianity. A mention was made of the calendar of the saints, the Sinkirsar. The Sinkirsar was originally written in Arabic in Egypt. It was translated in the late 14th or early 15th century into Ge'ez, but this is a case in which a translation of the work is terribly lacking because, of course, the translation of the Arabic work did not contain mentions of any of the indigenous Ethiopian saints. And so it was a perpetually renewed text in which more and more lives were introduced into it until around the late 16th century, sort of a, if you want to say, classic version of it existed. The Miracles of Mary, and there is, by the way, a marvelous website database, Digital Humanities Project, which presents the Ethiopian Miracles of Mary and indexes them by miracle and by art form and by date of manuscript and all sorts of other elements. The Miracles of Mary began to be translated into Ge'ez during the rule of King Dawit, who I mentioned. It was 14th and early 15th century. Once again, it was not the end of a process because Mary continued to perform new miracles. and those new miracles were added in to the book as it was perpetually renewed until there are thousands of these. So the Senkesar and the Miracles of Mary are two huge examples of Ethiopic literature, which are medieval productions. There was also a tremendous revolution of indigenous composition. One of the most important, one of the few cases where we can point to a specific author was Georgis of Sagla, who among the works he wrote the Book of Mystery, which is, to make a rough comparison, the Ethiopian equivalent of Aquinas' Summa, a massive theological work. The Organ of Mary, which is a praise of Mary, which went along with the miracles. The Praise of the Cross, and I'll say some words about the cross in a few minutes. And he also composed a new series of prayers to replace the Coptic prayers that were important in the liturgy at that time. Now, the Emperor Zariako, who is arguably the greatest of the pre-modern Ethiopian emperors, also is credited with doing tremendous work, whether he actually wrote the books himself, as the tradition said, or there was a royal scriptorium and that this is where they were composed, we can't know. But again, some of the books, the Book of Light, which dealt with the Sabbath and the cross and other important issues, Tomara Tesbet, the Epistle of Humanity, which was a polemic against the use of magic. And one of the articles that I've written that I'm proudest of is for a Festschrift in honor of Professor Sigbert Uhlig of University of Hamburg, in which I do a comparison between Zari Yacob and J.K. Rowling on their views of magic. That's one of the things you can do when you're a senior professor. Matsafa Mil'ad, which commemorates a victory of his against Muslim warriors, but also commemorates the birth of Christ, Matsafa Selassie and the Trinity, and the Book of the Pearl, which also is an anti-magic text. Let me skip that for... Saint Akhlahaimanot is in some ways the national saint of Ethiopia, certainly the best known of the indigenous saints. Two versions of his life were composed in the first half of the 15th century. Again, though he lived about 2 centuries before that. This is when his monastery became the most important monastery in Ethiopia, and since his life was written. Another widely known Ethiopian saint, again, who was known outside of the circle of one particular monastery, is Gabra Manfas Kedus, the slave or the servant of the Holy Spirit, who, as you can sort of see at the bottom here, was said to have amazing powers over animals and live in the wilderness and not be harmed. It is generally attributed to the late 14th, beginning of the 15th century. And Lalibela, who, again, anyone who's been to Ethiopia knows of the city named for Lalibela. Recently, Professor Dira, who was mentioned a few minutes ago, has written a book rethinking the history of the Zagwe dynasty, which I think I can safely say is the most important book in pre-modern Ethiopian history written in the last 50 years. The life of Lalibela is only written in the 15th century. In other words, the Zagwe are no longer in power. In fact, it could be argued the Zagwe are no longer a threat to be in power, and that's when he can be celebrated as a saint. So this period is a tremendous period in terms of literature. It's also the period when a form of Ethiopian literature known as the Malk, which is an effigy, an image in which a saint is celebrated in terms of his birth, his body parts, his death, his garments, begins to be composed. Rather amazingly, and again, there was a mention of Ethiopian art and trying to find evidence within it. It is only in this period that the Ethiopians begin to paint icons. That even though they have illuminated manuscripts, going back to the Garima Gospels, which are among the earliest Christian illuminated manuscripts, icons only date from the 14th and 15th century. And the icons went very much hand in hand with the development of the cult of Mary. Both Dawit and Zariako celebrated Mary and celebrated her cult and demanded the veneration of her icons. The other aspect that they did tremendous amount of celebration of was the cross, which again, obviously the cross existed in Ethiopia. One of the first evidence we have of the conversion of Ethiopia as a kingdom is the fact that crosses appear on coins when previously there were pagan symbols on the coins. But it's interesting, because Tsar Yaakov, let me just go down for a second, he decrees that the cross should be put on the royal palaces, and this is Dabra Behan, not the one obviously that he built, but a later one, and you see the cross on the top of it. He decreed that it should be on the clothes, the weapons, the plows, and it literally, if you want to think of tefillin on people's foreheads and on people's hands as a sign of belief. It was the Nike switch of the Ethiopian kingdom. It was how you knew someone was a Christian. There was also at this time, he introduced a cord that people wore, which was made up of cloths of 3 different colors, which symbolized the Trinity. It was called a matab, and you hung a cross at the bottom of it. And to remove your matab was basically a euphemism from being apostate. You were no longer a Christian. Now, the cult of the cross, I'll come back to this one in a second. The cult of the cross was also celebrated in the liturgical calendar. I can't talk about all the changes that took place in the liturgical calendar during this period, but one of them is the introduction of the Maskal festival, the Feast of the Cross, commemorating St. Helena's discovery of the true cross in Jerusalem, and the fire that she was supposed to have lit to announce this great event. And you see the bonfire, the Demara, that is part of the celebration of the cross. And I will give one final element, which I'll go back to. Although, again, we tend to view Ethiopian churches as these round churches which have a holy of holies and the division similar to the temple, and this is often pointed out as part of the evidence of the early Jewish influences on Ethiopian Christianity. We do not have these round churches before the early 16th century. So whatever it is that they indicate, it's not the antiquity of this form. So in a sense, what I presented here, I guess, is in some ways a paradox. There is tremendous continuity in Ethiopian culture, an ancient monarchy, ancient Christianity, ancient plow agriculture, and ancient Semitic languages. But in a strange way, the medieval period could be called the formative period for Ethiopian Christianity in terms of literature, visual, calendric, historical, and architectural products. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. My question is, you mentioned quite a few of these misconceptions in the beginning. One thing that always fascinated me is the origins of Maresha, the plow, the Ethiopian plow. So what's the current consensus on that? When does it start, or where does it come from?
Steve, thank you very much for your lecture. Since you spoke a lot of Mary, I want to ask you about Mary in the Quran. There are 2 passages in which Mary is mentioned in the Quran. There are 2 details that are not found in the New Testament, but are found in the Apocrypha. And I wonder whether are available also in Ethiopian sources. I mean that she gave birth near a palm tree, that there was a stream nearby. Do we find this in I never came across this in scholarship. Do you find these details in the Ethiopian Mary?
I would say that there's James McCann, who recently retired from Boston University, who's really the expert on Ethiopian agricultural history, and wrote a book called The People of the Plow. Probably somewhere in his writing or elsewhere has said something about the ideas about how the plow got to Ethiopia and things like that. And, you know, the Marian literature in Ethiopia is so vast. I mean, it's, as I said, you know, just the miracles are thousands. And then, you know, both Tsar Yaakov and Georgis wrote about her, and then that doesn't even count all sorts of other things that you find, and then consider the fact that the church in Aksum, which is, you know, Aksum Zion, is Mariam Zion. And the idea is that just as the church holds the word of God, the tablets of the law, and that Mary held the word of God, so you read something and it'll be called Der Sonnet Sion, the homily on Sion, and it turns out it's all about Mary. So I just haven't read enough of that to be able to say, but given the huge influence from Arabic literature, and that at an early period we know about overlaps with the Quran and Gez, and loan words from Gez that make it into the Quran and those things, I would be surprised if those traditions aren't there somewhere in some sort of source. A lot of the Ethiopian biblical interpretation material is material that's translated, that comes from Christian Arabic and then is translated into Gez and Amharic, and that would probably be a venue for that sort of thing. In terms of the Kebra Nagast, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of controversy about it still. I think that there's a very good, I mean, there have been, literary arguments have been made that it was translated from Arabic, and there's even, and I want to say his name is Hubbard, who was a student of Uhlendorf's who wrote a dissertation on it, which was never published, who made the argument it was translated from Arabic. But then that leads to the question is, why would that story be written in Arabic? Why would a story of the Queen of Sheba coming from Aksum be written completely out? And I think one of the things that we get is a confusion where people refer to the Kebra Nagast and they refer to the Queen of Sheba story, and they're not separating the different parts of that. And the story of the Ark is a different story from Menelik being born from the union of Solomon and Sheba. And so parts of it come from different sources. And then when you try and say this is the date or this is the source language, you're saying this is something for a whole, when quite likely it's really something from a part of that whole. Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting nervous signs from the organizers, so I apologize, and the rest of the questions would be over coffee. But I think I'll speak on behalf of everybody that the three panelists have set the bar really high and the standards for interesting and intriguing talks. So thank you very much for all three.